Greetings, I'm Margaret Kimberley, a member of the Coordinating Committee of Black Alliance for Peace and Executive Editor of Black Agenda Report. I want to thank the December 12th movement for inviting me to join this African Liberation Day event. Unfortunately, I can't join you in person, so I'm very happy that the organizers were able to accommodate me so that I can still deliver remarks to you all. The crisis in Ukraine was entirely manufactured by the United States. A continuation of aggressions, beginning with the 2014 coup, which was aided and abetted by the Barack Obama administration. That is where this story must begin, with the U.S. backing right-wing regime change in a dangerous and futile effort to counter Russian power, but which will likely lead to the end of Ukraine as it existed before February 24, 2022, the day Russian military operations began. Shortly thereafter, the Black Alliance for Peace issued a statement in which we said, "For African and colonized people to understand Ukraine, decenter Europe, and focus on imperialism." On February 24th, another military operation took place. The U.S. drone-bombed Somalia, and not for the first time. Every president from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden has either sent troops there, overthrown governments, or instigated other nations to invade Somalia. Just last week, Biden again sent troops there. These interventions have killed some 250,000 people and displaced 3 million more in that country alone. U.S. interventions have displaced some 37 million people in the last 20 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen. At Black Alliance for Peace, we note that Russia is condemned as a rogue state and Vladimir Putin as a war criminal, even as the U.S. and NATO criminality continues against African nations. The U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, has a network of bases and facilities all over the continent. Most African nations have military relationships with AFRICOM, meaning that the U.S. exerts control over these nations and their governments. This presence means that African people live under leaders who don't answer to them, but to the U.S. and former colonizers such as France, who actually are still colonizers. A French billionaire named Vincent Bolloré controlled 13 seaports in countries on the west coast of Africa. France still has troops in its former colonies and controls their currency. So we can't talk about Ukraine without talking about the totality of U.S. and NATO imperialism. In the early days of the war, the quiet part was often said out loud. That war in a European country was unthinkable, and that the idea of blonde and blue-eyed war victims was unimaginable. Of course, we know that the U.S. and NATO tore Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s because they didn't want an independent socialist state in Europe. The idea that war shouldn't be fought in Europe is both racist and untrue, which brings us back to the U.S. and the rest of its NATO partners, which are forces of domination and state violence. AFRICOM bases are among the more than 800 U.S. bases located all over the world. They wouldn't exist without the $780 billion defense budget, which is approved by Democrats and Republicans alike. A couple of weeks ago, we were informed that Joe Biden would request $33 billion in aid to Ukraine. Then we were told $40 billion, and the final number was more than $43 billion. I hasten to add here that Ukraine is losing, that all the military equipment promised will require weeks and months of training, time that Ukraine doesn't have, and that Russia is slowly and methodically destroying Ukraine's army and inflicting large numbers of casualties in the process. This aid will in all probability come too late to do them any good, as there may be no army left to utilize this equipment, which of course means that all claims of standing by Ukraine are false. That country is just the latest cash cow for the military-industrial complex, and the milking is done with our money. Ever since February 24th, we have been subjected to unprecedented levels of war propaganda. They need propaganda to justify giving billions of dollars to a kleptocratic right-wing government with actual Nazis such as the Azov Battalion in control of the military and the police. White supremacists from all over the world evoke Ukraine as an inspiration, and some even go there to fight. U.S. support for the Ukrainian government is a slap in the face to black people in particular. And what of black people in this country, 90% of whom voted for Joe Biden, who promised a minimum wage increase but didn't deliver it, who promised student loan debt relief but didn't deliver that either, who was said to be the most progressive president since Franklin Roosevelt, and that he cut child poverty in half? Both assertions were untrue. Now millions of people whose child tax credit was ended, but who didn't get the Build Back Better bill they were promised, are supposed to be silent as their money goes to enrich U.S. defense contractors and Ukrainian oligarchs. Only a handful of Republicans in Congress have pushed back, and every Democrat, including members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Squad, and the Progressive Caucus, have all gone along with this theft of public resources and a proxy war against another nuclear power. Once again, war making is bipartisan. In those early days, many of us debated what Ukraine had to do with us, whether it was a concern for black people at all. It is most certainly a concern when our money is used and when black left voices are censored in the name of countering the phony notion of disinformation. But as I said, we can't just think about Ukraine. We must be anti-imperialist. We must oppose neoliberal austerity in this country. We must oppose the 1033 program, which sends surplus military equipment to police departments all over this nation. Black people cannot be free as long as the U.S. and NATO allies try to control the world. That is why 17 different African nations abstained when asked to condemn Russia at the United Nations, and one, Eritrea, voted no. They chose the moment to exercise their independence and not go along with the charade. As we watched African immigrants and students being prevented from leaving Ukraine, I pondered why they were there at all. But they go because of colonialism and imperialism, which robbed their nations and robbed them of opportunity, and put millions of Africans at the mercy of the U.S. and NATO, whose objectives are antithetical to the people's needs. Africans now suffer from rising fuel prices and food scarcity, thanks to the ill-conceived effort to destroy Russia's economy. The value of the ruble has actually risen, but people all over the world, especially in the global south, are now suffering from American arrogance and delusions. We cannot have imperialism in one part of the world and expect to have justice elsewhere. We can't be surprised when a racist mass shooter in Buffalo, New York, wears the same Nazi insignia, the black sun, as Ukrainian soldiers do. The U.S. drive for full-spectrum dominance is inherently white supremacist. We can't condemn the lone gunman, but also support U.S. violence practiced around the world. It all has to go. The domestic cannot be separated from the international, and imperialist aggression in one country inevitably leads to it in another. So on this African Liberation Day, we must say no to imperialism, no to NATO, U.S. out of Africa, shut down AFRICOM, cut the defense budget and the $10 billion NYPD budget too. African liberation depends upon opposing every facet of an oppressive state. Thank you, and power to the people.